Hola nuevamente, buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches para
Good
quienes
morning
están
once again. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all who are joining us today. We wish to give you a warm welcome. We are on the panel for the law and evidence on self-managed abortion. My name is Lucia. I use the pronouns she, her, and I am postdoctoral research associate at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law. I have the honor today to present the first panel in a series of panels that we are organizing around a very important and very topical issue, both in the US context and in the global context, which is self-managed abortion and the law and the complexities of that relationship. First of all, I want to begin with a number of logistical issues so that I can then introduce my colleague and co-coordinator, Heidi, and the panelists that we have the pleasure of introducing today. For accessibility, we are pleased to offer simultaneous English-Spanish translation. To access it, you can select your language by clicking on the button that looks like a globe on the bottom right side of your screen and choose the channel of your choice. For security reasons, and to keep a cordial environment, we will have a closed chat, but you'll be able to ask questions to the panelists at the end, and so we can have a discussion and questions. We will be recording this panel, the session, and it will be available for those of you who aren't able to attend live.
Next slide. Gracias. Esta serie de seminarios, como comenzaba diciendo, está organizado.
As I was saying, this seminar series is organized by Patty Skuster and Adrienne Garashi of the Center for Public Health Law Research at the Temple University Beasley School of Law, as well as Heidi Mossesian of the Ibis Reproductive Health Research Institute, and Farah Diaz-Teyo of If When How Lawyering for Reproductive Justice. And finally, myself, Lucia Rosa, a postdoctoral associate at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law.
Siguiente plantilla, por favor. Next slide. Gracias. Como sabemos, las personas históricamente
historically, people have self-managed their abortions, and for several decades now, and with the increased use of medications, they've done so more effectively and safely outside of formal channels and without the supervision of health professionals. Self-managed abortion offers an alternative model of care that can serve both people in restrictive legal settings, as well as those who are living in more liberal settings. Self-managed or autonomous abortion has been recognized for its potential, not only in reducing mortality from unsafe abortion and the harms caused by restrictions on abortion access, but also, and even more important, to contribute to personal autonomy and reproductive freedom by shifting the hegemony of power from the formal medical system into the hands of women and others capable of bearing children. There has been a significant increase in evidence that self-managed medical abortion is safe and effective. And today, our panelists will share more on the state of the art of the evidence on the subject from different disciplinary and regional perspectives. We also know that although evidence indicates that self-managed abortion challenges the law and the categories by which it has historically regulated abortion. So there is still a legal risk, since even in contexts where there have been advances in the past decades. And so today we'll be discussing, and that's why we wanted to, these issues, and that's why we wanted to convoke to this panel, to summon to this panel, so that we can establish relationships between empirical evidence on the safety and efficacy of self-managed abortions and the laws, policies, and their enforcement. We will bring together empirical researchers and legal experts to explore the state of the evidence, the state of the law, and the relationships between those in the context of self-managed medical abortion in the United States and around the world. As I mentioned, this is a series of panels. This is the first one, and it's about what does the empirical evidence tell us about self-managed abortion. So we'll begin with an analysis of the latest state of this situation, and we will be looking and exploring and discussing in panel number 2 how the law affects people who self-manage their abortions. It has to do with the legal risks in panel number 3, and panel number 4 we'll be looking at the future of self-managed abortion, new care models in the future that we are faced with. So, as I was telling you, we're starting with panel number 2 of this series, and we hope that you can join us for the other 3 panels. So without further ado, I give the floor to my colleague and co-organizer of the series, Dr. Heidi Mosseson, an epidemiologist and senior researcher at Ibis Reproductive Health, whose research focuses on evaluating the safety and efficacy of self-managed medical abortion in diverse settings, measuring access to abortion care in restrictive US states, and inequities in that access, among other topics. Heidi will be moderating today's panel. And once again, thank you very much for joining us today. And I will turn the floor over to my colleague, Heidi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucia, and welcome everyone. As Lucia said, I'm Heidi Mosseson. I use she, her pronouns. So I'm going to set a little bit of additional context for our conversation today, briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll hand it over to each of them for a series of 10 to 15-minute presentations, at the end of which we'll have hopefully about 30 minutes together for a moderated Q&A. So as was mentioned, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to enter in your questions, and we'll do our very best to get to as many as we can. As Lucia said in her opening, today is the first panel in this series about self-managed abortion and the law. Our conversation today is centered on evidence, as you noted from the title. So I want to ground us a little bit in what we mean by evidence, because that term is thrown around a lot. So if you go to look in the dictionary, evidence is defined as grounds for belief or something that furnishes proof. Research evidence is defined a little bit more narrowly as facts that have been systematically collected and analyzed using explicit methods. The idea being that systematic methods reduce the risk of being misled by bias or chance. So systematic scientific research obviously is an essential means of advancing our collective knowledge, and it's a powerful tool for change, particularly legal and policy change, which is a core focus of this panel series. However, it's important to recognize that historically and currently, much scientific research has been rooted in principles of colonialism and extraction. Particularly in sexual and reproductive health, much harm has been caused in the name of scientific research, particularly for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, transgender and non-binary people, and many who experience marginalization around the world. A narrow definition of evidence that only includes this form of systematically collected scientific research excludes much of what we know evidence should include, which something that is grounds for belief. Under this broader definition, there are decades, if not centuries, of evidence that come from the experiences of accompaniers, traditional healers, and others who have supported thousands and thousands of people to use herbs, medications, and other means of safely ending their pregnancies. So while this sort of experiential evidence base has not always been documented or described in a way that the scientific or policy communities recognize, these sources of evidence are rich nonetheless, and an important source of knowledge and solutions, I think, for all of us as a community of people interested in self-managed abortion that we must include in our conversations. Today, our panelists will be focusing primarily on scientific evidence on the safety and effectiveness of self-managed abortion. And in quite powerful ways, I think it's exciting that much of this recent research has been conducted in partnership with accompaniers and other groups that are rooted in these decades of experiential evidence on how to safely support people to self-manage their abortions. Our panelists, in their order, will present research on the state of the evidence of self-managed abortion, recent evidence underlying the World Health Organization's recommendations on self-managed abortion, and also how local governments in various countries are or could use evidence on self-managed abortion to shape law and policy. This conversation feels particularly timely given recent and anticipated seismic shifts in abortion law in many of our countries. So with that groundwork set, I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. First, you will hear from my colleague, Dr. Caitlin Gerdts. Dr. Gerdts serves as the Vice President for Research at Ibis Reproductive Health and comes to us from Oakland, California in the US today. Then we will hear from Dr. Caron Rahn Kim, who serves as Medical Officer in the Department of Reproductive Health and Research at the WHO, who is joining us today from Geneva. Then we will hear from Dr. Onikepe Owolabi, a physician researcher and the Program Director of the Data-Driven Policy Initiative to Improve Women's Health at Vital Strategies. Oni joins us today from New York. And finally, Dr. Raquel Drovetta will present. Dr. Drovetta is a sociologist and social anthropologist from Argentina and currently a professor of sociology at the Universidad Nacional de Villa Maria and a researcher for the National Scientific and Technical Research Council, CONICET. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Gerdts.
Thank you, Heidi, and hello, everyone. It's lovely to be with you. As Heidi said, my name is Caitlin Gerdts, and I use she, her pronouns. And then I'll ask for the next slide. To start us off today, I want to make sure that we're all operating from a shared understanding of terms. When we talk about self-managed abortion, when I talk about it, I mean whenever someone does something, anything, to end their pregnancy on their own without clinical supervision. There are many methods people may use to end a pregnancy, including pills, herbs, and other approaches. For the purposes of the research I'll be sharing today and our conversation, I'll be focused primarily on self-managed medication abortion, which I define as whenever an individual attempts to end their own pregnancy by taking mifepristone with misoprostol or misoprostol alone outside of a clinic setting without any supervision from a medical provider. I'll refer to both WHO recommended methods of medication abortion, mifepristone in combination with misoprostol as well as misoprostol alone. It's important to ground ourselves in the history that self-managed abortion itself is not new. Throughout history, people have been self-managing their abortions, and we should not forget that it was pregnant people themselves in Brazil who first discovered the use of misoprostol as a safe and effective abortifacient, and how much the field and the world owes to them. People who are self-managing abortion may obtain medications at a pharmacy over the counter from an informal seller, ordered over the internet from a collective or a friend. And they're often supported in person or virtually through their process by someone in their support network or a counselor. People self-manage their abortions for a variety of reasons: personal preference to be at home, desire for privacy, and especially in the US increasingly as a result of legal restrictions that make clinic-based abortion unavailable or inaccessible to them, fear of discrimination or stigma, or many other reasons. Since the discovery of the use of medications for abortion, feminist organizations and collectives have and continue to facilitate access to safe abortion outside of health facilities. In Argentina, Nigeria, and more than 40 other countries, activists provide support to people seeking to end a pregnancy. This is what I mean when I talk about hotline or abortion accompaniment models. These are groups that provide people with step-by-step evidence-based information on how to safely use medications to end a pregnancy, information about possible warning signs, how to assess completion, and strategies for safely interacting with the healthcare system in the event of needing or wanting medical care. And they are with them, whether in person or by phone, every step of the way, providing on-demand counseling, information, support, and any follow-up needed or wanted by a phone, messaging, or in person. These organizations have been doing this work for decades in extremely restrictive contexts and have collectively supported many thousands of people in safely and effectively managing their abortion. Next slide. The most recent WHO estimates that we have, published in 2017, suggest that nearly half of the 56 million abortions worldwide may be self-managed in some capacity. Specifically, in using the WHO's 3-tier safety classification system, 31% of all abortions were considered less safe, i.e. were performed using WHO recommended methods like medication, but by providers who, until the recent WHO abortion guidelines updates that Caron will talk about shortly, were considered untrained. That included the pregnant person themselves, or by trained providers with non-recommended methods like dilatation and curettage. The assumption is that the bulk of those less safe, that bar in the middle abortions, were self-managed abortions with medication. Data on the incidence of self-managed abortions suggests that in some settings, the majority of all abortions may in fact be self-managed, including, for example, data that we have from India, where self-managed abortion with medications may comprise up to 70 or 80% of all abortions. Next slide. There's a growing body of evidence demonstrating that access to misoprostol and mifepristone were available, coupled with accurate information about medication abortion protocols, how to access completion, and warning signs that may include potential complications, offers people the ability to safely and effectively self-manage their own abortion. This evidence has been generated across a range of models in a range of different settings. Next slide. There are 3 common models of accessing pills and/or information around self-managed abortion: telehealth or online websites that provide access to pills as well as information on how to use them, pharmacies and community health workers who provide information, medications, and support, and, as I mentioned before, abortion accompaniment groups and safe abortion hotlines where trained volunteers provide evidence-based information as well as physical and emotional support through the abortion process over the phone or in person. Research on all of these models have shown that self-managed abortion, regardless of model and setting, can be safe and effective. I also want to say that there is a small but growing body of evidence documenting the safety and effectiveness of self-managed medication abortions beyond 12 weeks. Next slide. I now want to spend a few more minutes talking about the overwhelming strength of the evidence that we have on the safety and effectiveness of self-managed abortion, specifically by taking you on a deep dive into the largest prospective study published to date on self-managed abortion, and the only study to conduct a statistical comparison between self-managed medication abortions and medication abortions managed in clinic settings. Briefly, the SAFE study, conducted in collaboration between Ibis Reproductive Health and safe abortion accompaniment groups in Argentina, Nigeria, and Southeast Asia, is a prospective observational study designed to measure the effectiveness and safety of self-managed medication abortion with accompaniment group support. Participants were enrolled at the end of their first counseling session with the hotline, at which point they completed a baseline survey. Study coordinators then contacted each participant 7 days after taking the pills and 21 days after taking the pills for 2 follow-up surveys to measure abortion outcomes. Over approximately 9 months of data collection, we enrolled 1,051 participants in Argentina and Nigeria. And let me say again, this is a big sample size. It really is the first and the biggest prospective study with effectiveness of self-managed abortion as a main outcome. Next slide. Among the 1,000 or so participants with pregnancies ranging from 4 to 22 weeks gestation, 97% completed their abortion with pills alone, and 98.7% completed their abortion with additional intervention, MDA or DNC. In short, self-managed abortion with accompaniment support is highly effective. Next slide. Okay, this slide is a little bit in the weeds, but bear with me. Legal restrictions in both study sites precluded us from recruiting what we call a concurrent clinical control group. So that means a group that was getting abortions in a clinic. That was not possible. Instead, we conducted a literature review to identify all of the clinical trials that studied the same regimens that were used in the SAFE study. And we extracted and pooled the data from those studies on the effectiveness of medication abortion in clinical settings. Then we compared the outcomes from our safe study data to abortion completion outcomes reported in those prior trials. Because those trials restricted participation to people with pregnancies of less than 9 weeks duration, for the purpose of the analysis you're seeing on this screen, we're comparing abortion completion levels to study participants with pregnancies of less than 9 weeks duration. As you heard me say before, the SAFE study recruited up until 22 weeks gestation because that was what the accompaniment groups were supporting. However, this graph shows just the comparisons for those under 9 weeks gestation. The purple bar here on the left shows that in clinical studies of mifepristone and misoprostol use, 94.4% of people had a complete abortion without surgical intervention, while the orange bar on the right shows that in the SAFE study, a similar proportion, 96.4% of people who self-managed with mifi and miso in combination had a complete abortion without surgical intervention. With some formal statistical testing, we then conclude that self-managed medication abortion with mifepristone and misoprostol in combination is no less effective than clinician-managed medication abortion with mifepristone and misoprostol as demonstrated in the major clinical trials. Next slide. This slide reports on the same analysis as the previous slide, except that this time we're focused on participants who used misoprostol alone regimen. As you can see from these two bars, abortion completion following self-use of misoprostol alone is no less effective than clinician-managed use of misoprostol alone. Next slide. Finally, one area of concern that is often raised with regard to self-managed abortion is about access to formal health care in cases of complications. So we measured whether participants sought formal health care at any point during or up to 3 weeks after their abortion, as well as why that care was sought. We found that 20% of participants sought medical care at a clinic or hospital at some point during or after their abortion. The reasons that people reported seeking care are presented here. You can see that by far the most common reason was to confirm completion of the abortion. Consistent with other studies of medication abortion, participants reported very few safety events or complications from the medication abortion. Next slide. Moving on now to what we know about people's experiences with self-managed abortion. People who are self-managing abortion report experiencing a range of emotions and experiences very similar to what we see across people having clinic-based abortions. While some prefer self-managed abortion due to the comfort it provided them at home and increased privacy, others may not have preferred to take the pills on their own, but ended up self-managing because they couldn't afford to get to a clinic or were scared about their safety, facing stigma or legal consequences. Next slide. Finally, while research across settings has demonstrated that the highest standards of care are often not met for those self-managing abortions, in research that has been conducted across models of support for self-managed abortion, people consistently describe the importance of being treated with kindness, compassion, respect, and without judgment, as well as the value of receiving clear information in a timely manner. In studies conducted in collaboration with abortion accompaniment groups, before finding their way to the group, people often heard negative stories about abortion or faced fear or enacted stigma from formal health sector care. Conversely, during their care with the group, participants received compassionate, person-centered information and care. Through their experiences with abortion hotlines and accompaniment groups, many people reported gained knowledge and understanding of medication abortion, and some gained a sense of community among others who have had abortion. Next slide. Sitting here where I am in the United States, it is impossible to ignore the timeliness of this webinar as we await a Supreme Court decision that we anticipate will overturn Roe v. Wade and pave the way for at least 26 states to severely restrict abortion or ban abortion altogether. Of course, we know that a law making abortion legal has never been enough to guarantee access in America. Many individuals, especially Black people, people of color, historically marginalized communities, and people facing difficulties making ends meet have, throughout the history of legal abortion in the United States, faced immense barriers to accessing abortion care. And the restrictive laws in place have exacerbated and made those challenges in access even greater. We know that people in the United States have, as people have everywhere, self-managed their abortions throughout our history. And people have and do use a range of methods, including those that are ineffective or potentially dangerous, to safe WHO recommended medications. Next slide. We also know that people who self-manage in the US do so for a range of reasons, including in some cases a preference for avoiding interactions with the medical system that has discriminated against them or their communities, or has otherwise not served their needs. But also because for many, clinical care is too expensive or too far away. But as clinical care moves further out of reach for many in the United States, research has also shown us that many of those same communities who will be most impacted on by restrictive laws also face substantial barriers to access about information around self-managed abortion with medication, barriers which urgently need to be addressed. It is critical, though, that I end with a reminder that although self-managed abortion is safe and effective, and we have incredibly strong evidence to demonstrate that, it can even be a positive and empowering experience for some. The risk, especially for those seeking to self-manage abortion in the United States, remains a legal one. And because the anti-choice movement is inextricably linked to white supremacy, and because we live in a country where our carceral system systematically targets Black and Brown communities, that legal risk is already and will increasingly become borne by individuals in already over-policed communities. Next slide. Many thanks.
Thank you, Caitlin. We can go ahead and pass to Dr. Caron Rahn Kim.
Great, thank you. Good day to everyone. It is my pleasure to be speaking with you today on the recently launched abortion care guideline with a focus on the recommendations on self-management approaches contained within it. With Caitlin presenting much of the evidence that informed the set of recommendations, I will be taking you through the evolution of presenting that evidence in this new guideline. Next slide, please. So next slide. So what is this guideline? Next slide, please. So this guideline is a, go to the next one, is a consolidated and updated collection of the recommendations set in the WHO guidelines. I'm waiting for the slides to catch up. Okay, great. And so thank you. And here you can see the orange guidelines. Those are the prior guidelines that had been produced from our units in WHO. And this primarily started off as an update of the 2012 guideline. However, through the process, we felt that it was important to take up the recommendations that were housed in the 2015 health worker recommendations, previously known as the task sharing guidance, and the 2018 medical management of abortion. And just to note that the 2015 was where the self-management of abortion recommendation first appeared. So in total, this abortion care guideline represents the complete set of all WHO recommendations and best practice statements relating to abortion. Next slide, please. So here, the guideline is a result of a process that began in 2018, involving staff members from both WHO headquarters, regional offices, and a vast range of country expert contributors, several of whom are present today. Now, 2 points I want to note just on this slide is the green image on the left. This is the WHO Integrate Framework, which was used as a basis for deciding on the direction and the strengths of each recommendation, and includes a consideration of criteria that I'll be outlining in a few slides. And the second point I want you to see on this timeline is the existence of 3 ERRGs. This is the evidence, recommendation, and evidence review and recommendation groups. And we had 3 of them to focus on the different domains that the recommendations rest on. This was the clinical group and law and policy and health systems. Next slide, please. So I'll quickly take you through the structure and key concepts of this guideline to set us up for our self-management approaches. So if you can just go to the next slide, please. So this slide is showing the conceptual framework of the guideline, which appears throughout. Firstly, and very key for this webinar, is that this framework and guideline recognizes and acknowledges the needs of all individuals with respect to abortion. So in the center, you'll see it's the values and preferences of women, considering them as active participants in, as well as beneficiaries of health services. And so these recommendations are going across each stage of the abortion care pathway, the pre-abortion, abortion, and post-abortion. And so, as noted before, these recommendations go across the clinical care aspects, health service delivery, and the law and policy components. And as each individual moves through that abortion care pathway, they provide guidance on the who, what, where, and how. And of course, we want to focus in on the who, which is the woman. And finally, underpinning this framework is the enabling environment. And this is the foundation of quality abortion care. So the 3 cornerstones, as outlined in this figure, is of an enabling environment are the respect for human rights within a supportive framework of law and policy, the availability and accessibility of information, and a supportive, universally accessible, affordable, and well-functioning health system. Next slide, please. So to clearly indicate the strength and direction of each recommendation, the following wording is used. Recommend indicates a strong recommendation in favor of the intervention. Suggest is a weak recommendation that's accompanied by the conditions of use. And the third category is recommend against. So a strong recommendation against the intervention or in favor of the comparison. Next slide, please. There are 3 key concepts that run throughout our guideline, and that's important to highlight before I dive into our self-management approaches. First and foremost is abortion is healthcare. Second, a key concept is the emphasis in this guideline on quality abortion care, which is going beyond safe abortion. So this new guideline highlights the need of abortion care to not only be safe, but also effective, efficient, accessible, acceptable, and person-centered, and equitable. Quality of abortion care is foundational to this guideline. And the third key concept is the human rights integration, which is an overarching theme across the continuum of care. So each of the recommendation is accompanied by a box, as you see circled here, listing the key human right considerations relevant to the recommendation or the broader topic. Next slide, please. So now that I've set the background and set the scene, let's get into the meat of the matter. So self-management approaches is a dedicated section in the guideline, speaking to the various aspects to self-management of abortion, also including recommendations on self-administration of post-abortion contraception. Next slide, please. However, we'll be focusing on the recommendation itself on self-management of medical abortion. As highlighted before, this recommendation did appear in our 2015 guideline. So this is an update of that recommendation. And the primary update is that all components included in the process of self-management abortion are now strong recommendations. And this also includes the overall process of self-management in whole. And another key update is that the regimen of misoprostol alone is also included. Next slide, please. Now, in order to demonstrate how we got to this recommendation, I will take you through the methodology that lies behind WHO guideline recommendations. Next slide, please. So this is just showing the bulleted steps and the process of getting to the recommendations and getting to producing a WHO guideline. But the key components I want to highlight is the identification of priority questions, and then the retrieval of the evidence, and an assessment and synthesis of the evidence using the GRADE methodology. Then what followed in particular for this guideline update was the formulation of the recommendations by the Evidence and Recommendation Review Group, and then the finalization of the recommendations by the Guideline Development Group. Next slide, please. So here you'll see the recommendation as it appeared in our 2015 task sharing guideline, seen with those circles are indicating are equivalent to weak recommendations. So as noted before, we are now in the strong recommendation category. But as reflected in the figure on the right, we knew that there are many elements just at the start of this update process. We knew there are many elements to self-management approaches that we would need to unpack, especially given the amount of evidence that has emerged since the 2015 guidance. Next slide, please. So here is an overview, a snapshot of the PICO questions, or the priority questions that informed the recommendation for the self-management of medical abortion. And you'll see here in parentheses the number of studies that informed or went into each of those PICOs. So we had the overall PICO speaking to the process of medical abortion in whole or in parts, and then it's broken down into those subcomponents. So those were, in a way, sub PICOs that we treated as such. So the first component is being able to assess eligibility, and then 5 studies informed that recommendation, along with other components as well. And then the administration is, that component is when can the pregnant woman correctly administer medications for medical abortion. And this was a large Cochrane review that included 18 studies. So that was the that was the bulk of the studies fell into this category. And then a separate review was done to look at the individuals who underwent, can individuals who underwent the medical abortions self-assess the success of their abortion, and 10 studies informed that review. So if you can go to the next slide. So this is a very busy slide, but it's just a visual representation of the balance of risks and benefits. This is an example of the tables that were presented to the ERG and the GDG to show the balance of their risks and benefits. And so here it's just really showing, and this is an example of the question of the self-administration, and taking a look at, the main takeaway is that there's more greens to the reds, the greens signifying that the benefits of self-administration was greater, versus the reds was favoring more the comparison group, which was the provider administration. And then the yellows is showing comparable results. But even if you look closely, and the numbers are tiny, if you look at the numbers looking in the red, they were very small differences. And then on the column on the right is showing the outcome of the grade, or the certainty of evidence. Next slide, please. So this is another image of what was presented, because what we just saw was one component, one consideration that goes into a recommendation. So it is not that we just went by what was produced in the review and that's it, because as you see here, that just fed the first part, which is the effects, the benefits, the balance of the benefits and harms. The other aspects, and which was important to take into account, especially so for self-management approaches, were the values and preferences, equity, acceptability, and feasibility, and the resources required. So we performed qualitative analyses on those studies that couldn't apply the grade methodology. And then we also considered unpublished data that were shared by partners and collaborators. And so, and definitely we used the data that Caitlin had shown about the SAFE study. So it really is a collection of evidence that came to us and really spoke to each of these components that fed into the recommendation. And also to note that in terms of the resources required and the cost effectiveness, Also, it was timely that the scoping review series on the economics of abortion that was carried out by CONICET and her team really provided extremely valuable data to speak again to these different aspects that we need to consider to go into the recommendation. Next slide, please. So you see here, now it's a bit filled in of capturing the different elements of the evidence that was going to feed into our recommendation. And so, especially so, and just thinking back on the diagram I just showed you, the values and preferences and acceptability and feasibility was really important to capture. And so one way, in addition to looking at the unpublished data and the information that was shared by our partners, we decided to host a series of focus group discussions where we gathered key informants and stakeholders from across the globe to participate in structured discussions, focus group discussions, to share their experience, their perspectives and reflection on self-management of medical abortion. So all these different pieces is we have that element. And then once we have gathered all this information, it was important to discuss this across all the groups, across all of our ERGs, to take into account the clinical aspects, which was done, and the clinical ERG focused on those priority questions and the review results from that. But then we took that evidence and the discussions over to our health systems, because that aspect really was important to take into account, because they brought valuable information and additional evidence on the service delivery approaches. And then, of course, our law and policy group was an important group also to take a look at the evidence and to provide additional expert input on how to strengthen these the evidence base into making the recommendation beyond strong foundation, on a strong foundation. So next slide, please. So as a result, so along with the recommendation itself, and from all those different pieces that we were taking into account, it was really important to have this separate section on self-management approaches, because it was not only the recommendation, but the surrounding text that was very, very valuable and needed to be presented and shown and given equal bearing and weight as the recommendation itself. Next slide, please. So I'm going to have you click one more time, because this is an animation, a little bit of an animation. So putting it all together. So I put up some screenshots. Great, thank you. I put up some screenshots of the digital version of the guideline. And so here, this is showing the one page of the self-management approaches. And this is important to note on the right-hand side that there are related topics and recommendations to take into account when looking at self-management approaches. And so here that's highlighted is all the recommendations that speak to the law and policy, the provision of information on quality abortion care, provision of counseling, informed consent section, and then recommendations on the pain management for abortion. And then if you can click on the next slide, or just click again, perfect. And then you see here, we also have the key human right considerations that is relevant to self-management approaches, and wanting to just zone in on that last bullet, because again, this was, sorry, if you can back up one more time, if you can, just looking at that last bullet, the self-management abortion in line with human rights requirements should not be criminalized. And so this was important to connect and link over to our law and policy recommendation on decriminalization. And this is just noting in particular that criminalization of self-management of abortion can result in delays or barriers to seeking care. So In addition, so with every recommendation, we had these aspects, the key human right considerations, the linkage to other recommendations, and then we had the implementation considerations. And for the self-management approaches, it is a long list of considerations to take into account. Again, this was fed by our discussions with our expert groups and with our focus group discussions and the evidence that was reviewed. Next slide, please. So just to add another layer, I'm sorry, if you can move to the next one. I'm just going to move us ahead. There you go. Thanks. So just to add another layer is the evidence that was reviewed speaking to the various service delivery approaches. So recognition was made that this section on service delivery models and the self-management approaches were very much interlinked and just very difficult to disentangle. So that's the need to present them together in the guideline. And so it's just saying here that the process of medical abortion, either in whole or its components, can be provided, supported by a range of actors within the health system and at different locations. And so this, of course, includes the self-management aspect, and then also with the support of different health workers at various stages of the process. Next slide, please. So on just a little bit about the service delivery models, that's again, there's various types of evidence that was reviewed looking at the different examples and the approaches. And this included the accompaniment models that Caitlin discussed, community outreach, digital support tools, hotlines. We even looked into social marketing, social franchising, and then telemedicine. And then, next slide, please, the telemedicine, there's such abundant evidence, especially due to the COVID pandemic. It brought out a lot of data and evidence, so much so that this allowed for a specific recommendation to be made. And again, noting that this is an approach that can be an alternative to an in-person interaction. So next slide, please. And then we follow up with the best practice statements, which emphasize that there's no single recommended approach to providing abortion services and that a plurality of service delivery approaches can exist. Next slide, please. And that the best practice statement also points out that regardless of the approaches used in any setting, the total range of options together must ensure certain elements, including access to accurate information and quality medicines, referral supports, and linkages to post-abortion contraception for those who want it. Next slide, please. And then I'll take you to the last slide. So next slide. Thanks so much. And I'll end here with the various ways to access this guideline. I highly encourage you to visit the interactive web-based format you can see up here, which really best shows and displays the interaction of the recommendations and how they connect together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. We'll pass it now to Dr. Owolabi.
Thank you very much for being here, everyone. I'm delighted to be speaking with you today about the self-managed abortion evidence we need in the US right now, especially given the consequences of the likely SCOTUS-Dobbs decision and how this evidence can be used at state or city level in the US. I will speak primarily about the US because this was the remit for today, but then I will speak to my experiences doing work in other global settings where abortion is restrictive. Next slide, please. One click, please. So just to make sure that everyone on the call is aware of what's currently going on, I'm showing this graphic to sort of quickly give an overview of the legal and policy landscape in America. Even though it could not guarantee access for all women, the 1973 Supreme Court ruling on Roe v. Wade was a landmark decision where it was ruled that the Constitution protects a pregnant woman's liberty to choose to have an abortion without excessive government restriction. This struck down very many restrictive federal and state abortion laws. This was, of course, closely followed by Congress passing the first Hyde Amendment in 1977, which barred the use of Medicaid funds for abortion, except when the life of the woman was at risk. And this immediately compromised access for multiple low-income women and many marginalized communities, including Black women, Asian women, Hispanic women, and young women who are more dependent on Medicaid. Fast forward to 2022, and over the past 2 decades, US abortion access has become increasingly restricted, which is kind of the antithesis of what is going on globally, where many countries are moving towards liberalizing and safeguarding women's abortion rights. Since 2011, nearly 500 abortion restrictions have been enacted in the US, including laws banning abortion in certain circumstances, imposing medically unnecessary requirements on abortion care. And when the Supreme Court makeup started to change in 2018, everyone started to worry about the integrity of Roe v. Wade. And the decision we are all awaiting about the Dobbs v. Jackson case could result in a reversal of Roe. And this would then establish a legal status for states to enact pre-Roe bans, as well as currently unenforced trigger bans. The potential fall of federal protection for abortion access will not result in changes to abortion laws across the country. Rather, if Roe is overturned, access to abortion care will become even more dependent on states. And we can currently see that 13 states have trigger bans ready to be enforced if Roe is overturned. And overall, 22 states have laws that could be used to restrict the legal status of abortion. Next slide, please. I'm going to speak about the kinds of evidence that we need to collect and evaluate to understand accessibility to safe abortion care and the implications of changes in how self-managed abortion can be accessed in the United States today. I will speak under these broad domains: changes in the legal and policy landscape, provision of access to and the quality of comprehensive abortion care, outcomes of abortions and population level measurement of abortion indicators, and then equity, which is a cross-cutting issue. Next slide, please. As my colleagues have shown, self-managed medication abortion is safe and private, and with greater access to medication abortion pills, women are not likely to be at high risk of severe morbidity due to harmful invasive procedures as we saw pre-Roe. But the threat of criminalization and prosecution pose the biggest risks to the safety of people self-managing their abortions today in the US. Even though it might seem far-fetched, at least 21 people in the United States have been arrested for ending their pregnancies or helping others to do so since year 2000. Global evidence shows that the proportion of unintended pregnancies ending in an abortion is similar in context with restrictive and context with liberal laws, despite the restrictions. What is most compromised is the safety of people who obtain abortions. And this is why, for so many years, countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where the laws are most restrictive, have been consistently reported to have the highest rates of unsafe abortions. The US move towards restricting laws at the state level will put women who reside in these states in the same position that women who reside in these countries are. Since 2011, click please. Some state laws not specific to pregnancy have been misapplied by the police and prosecutors to punish people for self-managing abortions or those who support people to self-manage, creating stigma and fear. As of 2020, 5 states had antiquated laws criminalizing self-managed abortion. And due to stigma and anti-abortion motivations, police personnel and prosecutors may misapply laws that criminalize harm to fetuses, as well as other laws to target people who self-manage their abortions and those who support them. This threat of prosecution, including the risk of being reported by your physician or provider, impedes the public health priority, erodes trust in the healthcare system, limits access to information and medical care for people who self-manage, and may thus prevent people from using their preferred method of care because they do not want to risk their getting in trouble. To monitor this, we need evidence that collates publicly available data from states on facility and community level surveillance. So this means people in the community who might be trying to watch other people who have abortions, the anti-abortion movement. And if people who have abortions are reported, the incidences of arrests, the court cases, and the rulings, and what law enforcement does in states where the laws are restrictive. There's an urgent need to continue to systematically track all state abortion laws and policies and court proceedings, particularly those related to self-managed abortion, because as we can see, states are trying to regulate the access to medication abortion pills. It's also important to look at the regulation of mifepristone and misoprostol prescription, its availability in states, how these drugs can be financed and purchased by women, criminalization and protection of out-of-state abortion, postal mail tracking. And another thing that is of importance to note is the likelihood of their placing restrictions on other medications that could potentially terminate pregnancies. For example, methotrexate, which is commonly used to treat psoriasis. Next slide, please. Moving on to provider readiness to provide high quality comprehensive abortion care and their experiences doing so or not doing so in these times. The evidence available shows that if Roe versus Wade is overturned, almost half of all United States obstetrics and gynecology residents are going to lack abortion training. In 2020, 92% of OBGYN residents reported having access to some form of abortion training. Available data predicts that it could drop as low as 56%. This does not account for family physicians and other clinical providers who receive abortion training, including advanced nurse practitioners. Lack of training will have far-reaching impacts from abortion care to managing early pregnancy loss to treating people who manage their own abortions. We need evidence on the numbers and distributions of clinical providers who are trained to provide abortion care, including those trained to manage complications in medical schools and nursing schools. And we need to be able to track the number of trained providers who are subsequently available to practice across all states. Like in many of the restrictive settings where I work, it will become mandatory and important to know how clinicians perceive evolving state laws and policies, their experiences with people requesting abortion care, to understand their own fear of liability and decision-making about prescribing medication abortion, their preferences for referral, and their likelihood to refuse care even in states where self-managed abortion remains legal and accessible. It will also be increasingly important to understand from the clinical provider's perspective, the perceived impact of the changing abortion legal landscape on admissions for post-abortion care, what they're seeing in patterns of morbidity. And then, as all my colleagues have said earlier, it becomes imperative to study the experiences of doulas, accompaniment providers, and other support groups who are offering services to women. We would like to know the increases in their caseloads. We would like to understand the stigma they experience from their communities or from people around them who know this is what they do. We would like to understand how to make their work easier to ensure that women can access self-managed abortion. Next slide, please. Another really important domain, and where I think I have put most of my evidence, is people's access to high quality comprehensive abortion care. Comprehensive abortion care, as has been defined by the WHO and USAID over many years, includes both safe abortion care, wherein we have self-managed medication abortion, post-abortion care, the provision of contraceptive counseling, and linkages to other essential reproductive health services where possible. And this may include HIV prevention and treatment, gender-based violence services, FGM services in countries where that is applicable. As Caron and Caitlin have said, for people to safely undergo self-management of abortions, they need access to scientifically accurate information, high-quality medications, backup referral support if they desire or need it, and linkages to an appropriate choice of contraceptive services. Please click. Speaking about high quality information, a study by some of our colleagues showed that when women accessed online care, majority of them were able to understand the medicine leaflet packets. However, the ability to understand and be able to follow the instructions in these leaflet packets reduced in low literacy populations and in young people. To track the ability of people to access self-managed abortion care, we would need information on what people consult when seeking abortion care, where and how they ultimately access care, the time it takes them to reach care, and how much support they have during this process and from where this support comes. It will be critical to collect information and data on delays in treatment, especially in states where laws will be restricted to rape and where it can save the mother's life, because we all know from restrictive context that when abortion is allowed under such limited conditions, it is very hard for law enforcement and providers to assess and quickly decide on those conditions in time to have the abortion. We also need information on women who experience high-risk pregnancies and need to have abortions. And I'm speaking about women who are similar to the case in Ireland that encouraged them to repeal their restrictive abortion amendment. It will be important for us to collect information on access to and use of the combination regimen mifepristone, misoprostol versus misoprostol alone. And this is particularly important because misoprostol alone is cheaper than the combination regimen. Mifepristone tends to be expensive. And so we want to understand what drugs women are able to access. We want to know the best ways to provide clear guidance on misoprostol alone regimens, especially in low literacy populations. Current WHO guidelines do not put a limit on the amount of repeat doses that can be ingested to complete a pregnancy termination. And we need clear-cut ways to convey this to women to ensure that when they're self-managing using misoprostol, they know exactly what to do to have successful terminations. It will be utterly important to collect data on the experience of care when additional facility-based care is sought, the reasons why women are seeking care to make sure that care is not sought unnecessarily, and how they are treated by providers and other hospital staff. And this will lean largely into the stigma associated with obtaining an abortion in a restrictive context. We also want to conduct research on when and how people confirm their pregnancies and intervention studies to see if facilitating confidential and early pregnancy confirmation can improve the self-management experience, allow people to access drugs faster, and provide young people with the information they need to have safer first trimester self-managed abortions. Next slide, please. Another important domain that we need to study are the outcomes of these self-managed abortions and then population-level management of abortion. In all countries, there are gaps in the evidence base and the data available to estimate the incidence of induced abortion, the safety of abortion, and these gaps tend to be worse in countries with restrictive laws. With current changes in the US landscape, it is likely that complete abortion reporting will no longer be available in many states where the laws are restrictive. And so we will have to rely strongly on indirect approaches, as we have done in other parts of the world, to estimate abortion incidence in states which lack robust data collection systems. Another important point I would like to note here is that the provision of post-abortion care is a core obligation of states under the right to sexual and reproductive health. Regardless of whether an abortion is legal or restricted, all states are required to ensure access to post-abortion care. It must be available on a confidential basis. It must be available without discrimination and without the threat of criminal prosecution. And in line with post-abortion care, there must be access to a wide range of modern, safe, and affordable contraceptive methods. To support this, we need evidence on the outcomes of self-managed abortion by the source and the provider, the type of medication women are using. We want to know the characteristics of people who are obtaining post-abortion care services. We want to understand access to information and support and the proximity to supportive health services to provide post-abortion care when women desire to seek this care or they need to seek this care. We need information on how women assess the completeness of their abortions and the utility of providing urine pregnancy tests or multi-level pregnancy tests to improve their certainty when they self-manage their abortions. We want to know more about the requests for and experiences of receiving a post-abortion care. Do women it to be safe? Is there a risk of being reported to law enforcement by providers? And are women satisfied with the care they receive? Even though self-managed abortion is extremely safe, like my colleagues have said, it will still remain important to track patterns of morbidity in post-abortion care admissions. And prospective studies like that of Dan Foster and colleagues, the Turnaway study, which have examined the impact of having a delayed abortion or being a denied abortion, will continue to be of significant importance to women residing in places where they can no longer access self-managed abortion readily or safe abortion care. And lastly, even though it's very difficult to see the US in this place, we will get the opportunity to apply indirect approaches to estimate the prevalence of abortion, abortion-related complications, and to examine trends over time, because state-level reporting and provider and facility level reporting will no longer be complete and accurate. So researchers will have to find new ways to estimate the actual number of women who are obtaining abortions, as these estimates remain important for public health purposes, to estimate the number of unintended pregnancies and all pregnancies, and to enable the health system accurately plan for women's pregnancies and their outcomes. Next slide, please. Like I said earlier, equity in abortion access, quality, and outcomes is a really, really important domain which we have to study, given the fact that from the very beginning, restrictions like the Hyde Amendment and multiple state restrictions tend to affect marginalized communities much more than they affect other women. These restrictive laws include economic burdens from lost wages, childcare, travel costs, increased stigma, and reduced abortion rates. They, of course, affect ethnic minorities, people with lower incomes, immigrants, people with disabilities, gender and sexual minorities, and people who live in rural or medically underserved areas. For them, we need evidence similar to everything I've described before, but we would particularly like to understand their pregnancy confirmation trajectory to know how quickly they have access to the tools they need to decide that they are pregnant and this is an unintended pregnancy and they no longer want to keep it. We also need information on their abortion trajectories and experiences. Adolescents are a particularly high-risk group within the United States because of parental notification and consent, insurance status, and financial capability. For these groups, we would really like to understand the cost burden of abortion care, the prevalence of adverse abortion outcomes and or unintended birth, as we anticipate that when they cannot afford abortions, they will ultimately end up giving birth to children that were unplanned. We also want to continue to examine the maternal mortality and morbidity due to abortion-related complications, because the United States already has documented much higher maternal mortality rates in minority populations. And whilst we know that self-managed abortion is safe, restricting their access to safe self-managed abortions is likely to compromise their maternal health even more. And we also want to understand the prevalence of high-risk pregnancies and the outcomes in these populations. We want to conduct different interventions to know how to produce accessible and convey accurate, high-quality information on obtaining abortions to these subgroups. We would really like to find out how to leverage digital technology across all populations, but particularly for adolescents. And we would like to objectively assess expenditure on abortion support from individuals, abortion funds, pro bono providers, to understand how much is actually being spent to support women who might not be financially able to access abortions. It will also be important to explore how state restrictions influence access to self-managed abortions at school-based clinics, university health providers, and the impact of out-of-state students and how this affects college admission patterns and women's reproductive health in multiple states. Next slide, please. Of course, these are not all my ideas, so there's a laundry list of references I've drawn on, and I'd like to particularly thank my colleagues at Ibis, Reproductive, and Journey and Answer for the document they published in 2018, looking into what were important areas of research for self-managed abortions. Next slide, please. I'd like to acknowledge some of my colleagues at the Guttmacher Institute who work extensively on US-based abortion research and help me frame my ideas. Last slide. And I'd like to say thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing all the research that comes out to continue to advocate for access to self-managed abortion for women in the US and around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oni. Now I'll pass to Dr. Drovetta.
Hola, buenos días, ¿cómo están? Es un placer.
Good morning, how are you? It's a pleasure for me to be with you. Can you hear me?
Okay. Muy bien.
Okay. Can you hear me well? So I want to start by telling you that my presentation is going to be basically visual. Images are very important for processes in Latin America, particularly in South America, where the lines of information regarding safe abortion have been carried on. They have been promoted by political groups, feminist groups who have tried to work in favor of achieving, getting a law passed to decriminalize abortion. And for over a decade, we have also been working on trying to destigmatize abortion for society. So a decriminalization, social decriminalization of abortion. One of the strategies that has most been used by these groups of women, of feminist women, have been images, political mottos. That is why here you will see me use images that have complex readings that are inextricably linked to the socio-political context of Latin American countries. The first one, thank you. As Caitlin was saying, the studies and the first scientific demonstrations that have linked the soul of misoprostol in Brazil have been very important in our region because they constitute the first evidence that have led us to realize that misoprostol used in the 1980s by women in Brazil, where they were recommending the use of pills for safe abortion. The first scientific studies, which are by Margaret Ardila, Dr. Faundes, show us how in 1993, 1996, in the city of Goiânia, a very important statistic emerged where for the first time a scientific link was established between the sale in pharmacies of the patented medication which contains misoprostol was linked to a reduction of hospitalizations due to abortion complications in the city of Goiânia. And this was very important for terms of establishing a background for future research. Then another 10 years would elapse before they started to use the name of Oxapros, which is the name of the misoprostol in Argentina. And by 1995, 1997, importantly, this medication was circulating in the hands of women, which is very complex. What was very complex to understand was that the recommendations of use between people was verbal, and they referred to the use of 1 or 2 pills, and that it had to be moistened to give you access to the center of the pill, and that with 2 pills, you could achieve an abortion. And these recommendations, of course, today seem impossible, but at that time, they were the result of the use by many women of this method, even though they did not have a clear understanding of a safe protocol in using this medication, which often led to incomplete abortions. Looking at the next slide, we have an image of an idea of the first line of information regarding safe abortion in Argentina. It was created in 1999 and was called More Information, Less Risk. And it was published and used by an organization called Lesbians and Feminists for Abortion Decriminalization. They were the pioneers in South America, and they worked out of or based in the city of Buenos Aires, and of course served the population of Buenos Aires mainly. And then subsequently, they would receive requests from other parts of Argentina. One of their main achievements was a publication in 2010 of a manual on a guide on how to have medical abortions. It was distributed for free or with a voluntary donate in exchange for a voluntary donation through different events and meetings of feminists. In 2010, it was also possible to download it free from the web. It was edited once again in 2012, and this new edition was published by the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, which, for those of you who know the Argentinian context, this is a publisher that is linked to, as I said, the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. And of course, this has is very important in the political context, which groups women from many different political views. And the idea was that this guide could transmit in a convey in a very simple way the recommendations of WHO on how to use misoprostol, which was in a patented medication. And this manual provided a very clear protocol on how not to use less than 12 pills to achieve a complete, successful, safe abortion within the first 12 weeks of gestation. Then we were able to gather evidence and publish 8 reports a year. And they were able to get information from women who were calling into the hotline to get information on how to use the misoprostol. And they were gathering this data. The idea was that what they realized was women were not communicating with them afterwards, so they didn't know, couldn't make a follow-up on whether the abortion had been successful, whether they had been able to complete it, or whether they had required medical assistance, care afterwards. Something important here was the search for availability in pharmacies where the patented medication was available at that time, when we used the adjective of friendly for everything that was not aggressive against the women's organizations. We said that these were friendly pharmacies, such as the same thing for the care providers that we also designated as friendly. This organization's major political work really had led to bringing, publishing the first evidence on this topic, but it also had a major influence on politicians, because the motto that abortion had to come out of the closet, that abortion was also a topic of interest for lesbians and feminists. This opened the path toward social discrimination of abortion. The idea was, the goal was to destigmatize abortion. And in 2019, after 10 years, they closed, the group closed down. I forgot to mention in the previous slide, we were looking at Barbie, who is known worldwide, and she's saying that she had a successful abortion. And that was a way to reach out to the public and take away the negative connotation from people who abused women to obtain for financial reasons, or the provision of abortions in dark caves. So currently there is this group of feminists called Socorristas en Red trying to demonstrate that it is possible to have accompanied safe abortion through support from other women within the organizations. This organization, Socorristas en Red, was created in 2012, and as of 2014 and up to date, they started gathering evidence to automate the data obtained with certain goals. One of them is that this gathering, automation, and publishing of the data on women who look for an abortion with misoprostol today contributes to destigmatizing the profiles of these women who have abortions, to stop supposing who women are, what type of women have abortions, that was based on racial, class, and generation groups. This allows us today to see the diversity of women and people, not only women, because also transgender people have abortions using misoprostol. I would like to invite you to check out the website of Socorristas en Red, which is at socorristasenred.org, and there you can see all the reports going up to July 2021, including all the data, main data, socio-demographic data, medical data on the efficacy of misoprostol in women for the period of 2014 to 2021. This is an extremely rich database on clandestine abortion in Argentina, and up until the Bill of Law was approved on January 14th of last year, 2021. Between 2014 and 2020, 55,000 women and other women able to bear children called Socorristas en Red, had personal interviews with members of the group, and used misoprostol or mifepristone to carry out their abortions. 73% of these people decided to have a self-managed abortion accompanied by people they selected or by members of Socorristas en Red, whereas 14% requested to have an abortion from an accompaniment from the health system. What's important here is regards the data collection by this organization shows that how the pandemic impacted in a surprising manner the number of safe abortions in Argentina. For 2020, Socorristas en Red at one point had their assistance for women who called 17,500 people called one of the 35 lines who could keep that they could access with a minimal financial cost. And during the year of the pandemic, the accompaniment for aborting in the health system increased by 55% before the law, but by 800%. The law was finally passed on January 24th of 2021. And then it was legal to have abortions in the health system in Argentina. And the number of women who called Socorristas en Red asked to be hospitalized to have a voluntary interruption of their pregnancy. It continues to be a low number since the law now does allow Argentinians to request, or people in Argentina to request this service, but it has taken women in Argentina years and decades of abuse, and this cannot be eliminated. All of the stigma cannot be eliminated all at once in an Argentinian society. Now I would like to talk to you about the future in Latin America from our standpoint and from our geographic standpoint is in Latin America. And this allows, through communication of Socorristas en Red with organizations from other Latin American countries, has allowed us to establish a network. Each of them has their own idiosyncrasies, but they all basically in common have the giving advice, counseling services in these 15 countries on how to have safe abortions. They, of course, these countries all have very different realities, very repressive contexts, such as in El Salvador, where they have safe abortion hotlines, such as in Uruguay, where the law allows for abortion, but still they constitute a source of information, such as in Argentina. And then we would have to ask what's going on with Brazil, where the Bolsonaro regime has delayed any type of progress that could have occurred in this field. Now I would like to leave you with 3 small conclusions on our Latin American experience, and I would like to invite you to check out the websites for these organizations that are full of information, of hope as well, to be able to overcome the adverse contexts. The first lesson that we can learn in our territory, or from our territory, is that once abortion becomes law in our country, feminist organizations or women's organizations do not close their doors at all. History has shown that organizations must continue to work because the law must be protected, and the right to receive service from the health organization must be guaranteed, and this can be achieved through women's organizations and feminist organizations. Brief second idea that I'd like to leave with you is that the women organizations are producing scientific knowledge, and they must continue to receive support because they contribute evidence on how misoprostol works, and misoprostol used in association with mifepristone, and they have been able to make it visible that the use of misoprostol and the accompaniment of women through the process increases the success rates to the point that that is the level desired by the WHO, which is 95%. And we know we are able to do research into these experiences, because in Argentina, for example, we are facing new challenges as to how to provide abortion services for women in their second trimester of pregnancy. And these organizations are looking for ways to give safe processes to have abortions in the second trimester, because this is a fact that we cannot ignore. This is happening. And then we also, as a second task, we have to discuss and understand legality in our country, and we invite to a new interpretation of legislation, understanding what is legality, what is illegality, and what are we referring to when we speak of illegality, when we're trying to break these barriers, or at least to reduce them. And these groups in Argentina have played a very significant role in achieving or getting us to understand the law in a much more open way. This is all I have for you today. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you to all of our panelists and our attendees. We know we ran over by a few minutes, but we've been so grateful for the thoughts that our panelists have shared, the questions they've raised. And to each of you as our attendees, we've been trying to keep up with your questions in the chat. We will follow up in the next few days with a recording with panelists with slides from the panelists, and please do reach out with additional questions. We're excited to keep this conversation going and hope to see you at the second panel in this series. Thank you so much, everyone.